Welcome to our breakout session, Food Movement Voices. The pandemic is a driver for restaurant industry change. As a reminder, you can engage in the Q&A by typing your questions in the chat box. And it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Taylor Reed.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Taylor Reed, and I'm an assistant professor in applied food studies at the Culinary Institute. And over the next half hour, I encourage everybody to put your questions for our panelists in the chat. And I promise to get to as many of them as I can toward the end of our time. Next slide, please. In this session, we're going to briefly present the results of a research project exploring the experiences of chefs and restaurant owners during the pandemic, then spend the majority of the session with our chef panelists who will discuss their experiences working for social justice within the restaurant industry and the ways in which these efforts evolved over the pandemic year. The first thing I want to do is take a moment to acknowledge my collaborators on the research project that we're going to be talking about. It's really, for me, been a terrific experience to work with both Ben Wilson, who is a political economist at SUNY Cortland, and was closely involved with creating the session, even though he isn't presenting with us today. And Max Sussman, who is the chef owner of Samisa Restaurant in New York City. And Max will be presenting a summary of our research results in just a couple of minutes. So next slide, please. I just want to give you a little bit of background on the research project, and then I'm going to turn it over to Max. Our research on restaurants' responses to the COVID pandemic began in May 2020 as a student project in my capstone course in applied food studies here at CIA. Students developed a comprehensive interview script and conducted in-depth interviews with restaurants from across the country. Another group of students took the project over in the fall of 2020. And all told, there were 19 interviews lasting between 40 minutes and an hour and a half. It was really a rich data set. And all of these interviews were recorded and transcribed. Those transcriptions serve as our data for analysis for this project, which is what Max is going to present to you. The interview subjects were all individuals with decision-making responsibility in their restaurants. Most of them were owners or chefs, but there were people with a couple of other positions in restaurants that were interviewed as well. Restaurants were spread across the country to places including Toledo, South Carolina, New Orleans, Northern California, just to name a few. They really were all over the country. But the largest cluster was in the Hudson Valley region of New York State. Restaurants ranged from food trucks to fast casual and fine dining, and from small independents to restaurant groups with as many as 5 locations. The initial objectives of the project were to understand how restaurants adapted to the pandemic, how they overcame unexpected challenges and obstacles, and how they think the pandemic will change the restaurant industry in both the short and long term. Max and Ben's involvement has allowed us to expand our analysis to ask deeper economic and social questions, exploring theoretical issues related to value, price, competition, and state involvement, but also a number of practical questions about social justice and the day-to-day operations of restaurants, which is what I'm going to now turn it over to Max to talk about. Next slide, please. And Max, you're on.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Taylor. And I'm going to go quickly through and talk about some of the patterns that emerged as we were going through the really fascinating research that Taylor's class carried out. So needless to say, every restaurant reacted differently. There was actually no real blueprint for how to get through this situation. And so people were left to their own devices and innovated and adapted in a wide range of different ways. So, some restaurants closed completely, others pivoted to takeaway, and everything in between. And of course, these responses changed throughout the pandemic. We were speaking just before this about how some of the decisions that we all had to make seem like, lifetimes ago, and we've even changed since then. So in terms of some of the innovations and adaptations, changes in menu, changes in service format, staffing structure led to different relationships between the front of house and the back of house, which we will hear about from our panelists in a little bit. Obviously, outdoor dining was a really new thing for a lot of operators. And we even noted that some restaurant owners were quite innovative with their use of PPP loans, even creatively investing the funds before they had to be returned to the government in some instances. There were a lot of problems with the response, and this was another big pattern that emerged. The federal response was just largely inadequate and confusing. However, it showed us the potential and the importance of federal response and support structures to keeping restaurants going. If we felt that this created tension between the desire to do the right thing and the need to keep restaurants' doors open, and the as well as there being inconsistency with the guidelines in terms of masking, social distancing, and the capacity. So we found that the federal response was really, really important, and at the same time lacking in some really critical ways. The pandemic was an opportunity for reinvention for a lot of restaurants, both in a positive way and in a negative way, for depending on who you were talking to. But more broadly, it kind of created the opportunity to stop and think about how things work in the industry and think about changes that need to happen, and in a lot of instances, an opportunity to implement some of those changes. So we noted that this was really, really interesting as restaurants reevaluated their role in the community in a time when it was impossible to gather in large groups, which is one of the main ways that we imagine community building happening. Community safety, which was a very, very common theme and pattern that emerged throughout a lot of the research and interviews. And this we wanted to note, which was really interesting, as it in a lot of ways goes against the logic of what we think a for-profit business should do, which is just make money at all expenses. We really noted that a lot of restaurant owners and managers prioritize the safety of their community and their staff. And again, this kind of goes against the conventional logic of what a lot of people think restaurants do. They're not necessarily just businesses, but they're also community anchors, which was a big theme that emerged as well. So we noted that restaurants really play a huge role in constituting communities, not just in a financial sense, but in many broader ways. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And so we wanted to also note, in addition to the patterns from the interviews, some future directions that we thought would be really interesting to pursue based on what the restaurant owners and operators and managers expressed to us. So broadly speaking, how can restaurants be used as institutions that address social justice issues? So some obvious in-restaurant issues are restaurant culture, toxic culture, pay disparity, and racism within restaurant industry. But also these issues mirrored a lot of the struggles that were happening outside of restaurants. How can we emerge how can restaurants emerge as more socially sustainable institutions, and as well as providing support to other social movements, whether it's providing food or providing other forms of support. Throughout the pandemic, there's a heightened sense of agency among restaurant workers, which has been coming out in what is often referred to as a worker shortage, but there's different ways to look at that topic. And restaurants are reopening, looking for staff to hire, and workers are deciding for themselves where they want to work and having a lot more choice in that matter, and ownership needing to get buy-in from the workers. So there's just a really new relationship and structures that are being formed here. And along that note, future research on this topic, we would like to note that it should include worker voices and not just the owners and managers of the restaurant. The big question is are these changes sustainable? So what's going to stick and what's going to fade away, and what will influence whether these changes stay or whether they are temporary? Institutional changes as well. There's many restaurant owners, operators, and workers experience frustration with some of the mainstream restaurant organizations, and there's a lot of different reactions between from the small restaurant groups to the big franchises to the more independent restaurant owners. And in terms of the policy responses and the government's role, we wanted to note that policy and money are deeply connected. There's a lot of flaws around the financial support that existed, as well as racial disparities in the way that they were distributed, and that the restaurant industry as a whole needs to get more engaged in the political process if it wants to make these changes more permanent and meaningful. So those are just some of the areas and patterns that emerge, as well as some of the future directions that we would like to carry this research in, and some of the areas that the restaurant industry will be having to deal with in the next few years. So that is the summary, and I'll pass it back to Taylor for now.
Thank you, Max. And please remember, you're welcome to put your questions for Max and I in the chat. But now I would like to go ahead and introduce our two panelists. Jihye Kim is a chef and managing partner at Miss Kim, a Korean farm-to-table restaurant that is part of the Zingermans group in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Kevin Mitchell is a chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston and co-author of Taste the South, South Carolina's signature foods, recipes, and their stories. And they both have much longer, impressive bios that you can check out in the program. But I want to spend as much time talking to them about their experiences as possible. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions as of my own, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat and I'll get to as many of those as possible. The first question is for Jihye. Can you tell us about how the pandemic has affected your staffing structure and the way that you pay your workers and the decisions that you had to make through the pandemic?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me. So I think last year, Michigan shut us down maybe a couple days before St. Patrick's Day. And as you all know, the restaurant industry was the first ones to be shut down for indoor dining. That means all of our front of the house staff were pretty much displaced. And the back of the house was intact because we were able to pivot to takeout and delivery fairly fast. And then we had some people who were either high risk or didn't feel safe and didn't want to continue coming into the work because in the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know a lot about this disease. So we were faced with this overflow of front of the house staff who didn't have a position anymore, and a little bit of back of the house staff leaving voluntarily. So instead of trying to find more back of the house staff, I asked front of the house staff who are in good standing that back of the house positions are the only ones available, and if they'd be willing to transfer to a different department, and then we'd be happy to train them. And that actually has worked out very well. And so I think staff structure has changed because the one department like pretty much moved into a different department, but pay really didn't have to, because we're one fair wage restaurant. So the pay structure is transparent and not quite different from front of the house and the back of the house, unlike the traditional restaurant setup. So our servers are not on tipped minimum wage. So there was a little bit of pay equity. So we could really focus on transferring the staff to a different department, focus on training, focus on making sure they feel supported and comfortable and meeting job expectations. We didn't have to do much change on how much they're getting paid, and they only had to decide if they wanted to learn and be in the back of the house, and they didn't have to worry too much about how is this going to impact my pay going from tipped environment to just hourly. So that has worked very well for us.
Thank you, Jihye. And Kevin, the first question I have for you is, you're involved in the Southern Foodways Alliance and a number of other important social movement organizations centered around food. How has the confluence of the pandemic and the reaction to George Floyd's murder affected the direction and priorities of the organizations that you work with?
Well, thank you for having me. I think most definitely those two major events happening really not too far from one another. A lot of the organizations that I deal with or more so involved in as far as being a member or board member took the path of, like everyone else did, as far as pivoting. And they pivoted to making sure that the messaging of those organizations was very clear as it related to social justice, as it related to equity, as it related to specifically to racism. And the one example I have is the Slow Food organization, of which I'm a national board member. They were actually doing this prior to the pandemic and prior, of course, to George Floyd's murder, by creating a what we call the EIJ manifesto. And EIJ manifesto is the Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Manifesto, which basically spelled out how they were going to address some of the social issues in the restaurant industry and also in the food system industry as well. Those, as far as farmers or producers. And by creating this manifesto, which basically, some of the key points were, creating an environment for support and respect for the BIPOC community, basically education, which is, of course, the most important thing for me as an educator, and just creating this manifesto in which they mandate the people that they deal with, whether it's a farmer, a producer, so on and so forth, that these people also adhere to what these key points are in the manifesto. And then getting the message out to letting those people know, especially those of BIPOC communities and other marginalized communities, that they were going to use their organization to further address some of those social issues. And you and I had a conversation a few weeks back as far as how those two events have exacerbated what the social issues are in the restaurant industry, and meaning that there was more of a light shined on those issues, even though those issues were already there. We may not have been talking about them on a really high level, but those two events really put those things in your face. So the organizations, they once again they pivot, they change their messaging to address some of those issues.
Thank you, Kevin. And Chihei, we all know that doing the right thing can sometimes be expensive. Can you talk about the ways in which it has been beneficial to your business?
Yeah, absolutely. Our restaurant opened as one fair wage, so that has been sort of going up against what everybody else is doing, and it can be very challenging. But with the pandemic, I really do feel that I saw the benefits of sort of clear pay structure, equity between front of the house and the back of the house, start paying off, because we were able to really retain a lot of our staff, this like regardless of which department that they worked, and and we like zingermans as a whole, we love meetings, so we talk a lot. We were already meeting once a week even before the pandemic, but we started meeting more often to make sure that everybody had a voice in the room and felt safe and participated in the decisions that we make. And those things also cost money, because like meetings are not free, people are hourly and we pay for their time. And I think it's easier to say that you pay $3.15 versus you pay like $12 to $14, $15 an hour, and it's a lot more expensive and it's not financially sustainable. But we like really didn't have the need to hire because our retention rate was so high until like last November or December, and we are hiring now. But our challenges of hiring is it's always difficult to find good people, but it's the same as before the pandemic. It's not more difficult because of the pandemic. And I think the benefits of having solid staff with you and not having to staff extra people, and that goes into training, having the consistency of the product, and then being able to keep up your quality because your staff already know what to do and they're bought into your organization. Those things are more difficult to calculate, that it pays back more in the long run. And I really do see that. I really did see that with the pandemic, and I do see it even more now, especially when everybody's talking about how they like nobody wants to work situation.
For Kevin, have you seen anything coming out of the restaurant industry in the past year that gives you hope that it can be a positive participant in the broader fight for racial justice?
Well, yeah, I've seen specifically in the Charleston community where the leaders, restaurant owners are taking more of a responsibility in understanding their role in social justice, and understanding that the restaurant is not just purely a business. It's part of a community, and that these leaders have to take more of an active role in the community to get consumers into the building. And I think on the consumer side, restaurant patrons, they are actually getting more involved in issues dealing with social justice as well, and they are deciding where they're going to spend their dollars at places that are socially responsible. And if responsible, of course, they're not going to patron that particular business. So I think those two things are a couple of really great examples of what is happening in the restaurant industry. And I think, even beyond the consumers and the leaders, the employees, the cooks, the dishwashers, all those people behind the scenes, they are becoming a little bit more responsible in understanding what their role is in that restaurant as a part of that community, that it's important for them to get involved in that. And seeing the leaders allowing their staff to participate in social justice, in protests, and not having any or giving any repercussions if someone on their staff is involved in a protest, or not allowing those employees to have a voice in what is happening in the community. And I think that is the biggest responsibility of the restaurant industry, is to allow for not only your staff but your consumers. And specifically, it all falls on the leaders and the owners, and make that come from the top down, so we can address the issues that so plague our industry.
Thank you. And Jihei, you alluded to this a little bit in your answer to the last question, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the nature of the way that Zingerman's group works collaboratively, and how that helped you all to navigate the challenges of the pandemic.
Yeah. It's it's sort of nice when you're struggling that you have somebody that struggles with you. So Zingermans is food or food related businesses, and there's a founder in Paul Sagan and Ari Weisenwag. But between the businesses, there's actually no financial commitment. So like, I don't have a stake in Zingerman's Delicatessen, and Zingerman's Delicatessen doesn't have a financial stake in my business. But we agreed that we're going to operate under the same set of values, principles, and goals. And when the pandemic hit, it was great to have like a group of business owners who I already share the same values with, to get in the room, like Zoom room, and talk about like anything from mask policy to vaccines or customer service, or what ideas we have in terms of pivoting or diversifying our revenues, ways of sales, and sort of talking that out has been really good, because it's less isolating. And when you're trying to make a decision that prioritizes the safety of your staff or the customers, or prioritize the care for the community, and it's not just driven by finances, it's nice to have people who are doing the same thing that has your back, and making like a, in my restaurant, when we were making policies that affects the staff, we talked to the staff, and because those policies will impact the staff the most. And to have a similar kind of collaborative conversations about like, if we're going to apply for PPP loans as opposed to EIDL loans, and how that goes, and what broad mask policy are we going to implement, what social justice statements we're going to put out, like that has been incredibly helpful, and reminds you that even when you're not going outside and you're not seeing each other's faces, you're still part of a community that you're responsible for.
Kevin, if I was to put you in charge, how would you restructure the restaurant industry or our food system in order to address racial justice issues? What's the role of new institutions like the Restaurant Workers Community Fund or others in facilitating that process?
Well, I think the word with restructuring, I mean, the first thing is, I think you need to blow it up and then kind of put it back together. And you need to look at everything from a really acute vantage point and understand where, basically, for example, your hiring practices, your performance evaluation practices? Do you create a environment of collaboration, right? So all these things kind of intertwine with one another, and just going back to blowing that up, looking at who is in charge, right? The person in charge is the one that is setting the tone for how people in the food system are treated, how they're compensated, um, whether or not their voices are heard. So I always go back to starting at the top, and then when you start at the top, the most important thing is also looking at the educational piece of it as well. How are you educating your staff, your coworkers, the leaders? How are you, compensating the people that are really the most important part of the food system, whether it's a grower or farmer? How are you compensating them? How are you using or giving them business as opposed to giving someone else their business? Are they following the same value systems that you have? Do they address social issues? Are they involved in trying to create equity for one another? Because I think equity is always the most important thing as it relates to, when you're looking at at racism, BIPOC communities. Are you offering them a piece of equity? Are they the workers, or do they have a piece of the action? I think if they have a piece of the action, they take more of a important role in how that food system all works, and it's all intertwined with people, everyone that's involved in that, and just making sure that everyone knows that they are a part of it, that their voices are being heard, that the issues are being addressed, and that no one is getting left behind.
Jihei, the response we've heard from others through our research is that government pandemic relief wasn't well targeted to the restaurant industry. Do you have any suggestions for how state supports could make doing the right thing less expensive?
Yeah, I think the government response, especially when it comes to PPP, I thought was interesting because it really, really focused on the owners, and it didn't really address the taking care of the staff. But restaurants don't run without the staff, so I thought that was an interesting way to distribute help. I think one thing that states can do is, I would love for the tipped minimum wage to be abolished. I think a lot of us already know that it has sort of a racist history and origin in the United States, because it was a way of, from the beginning, it was a way of undercutting income to people of color and women later on. And when we try to do the right thing, and I get customers who go like, oh, the food was great, the staff was really, really friendly, and I know you use compostable containers and provide community meals, but it's still too expensive. And part of the reason is because we pay people more, and there are states who have implemented like a higher minimum wage and did away with tipped minimum wage, and their restaurant industry is thriving. So I would love, like state of Michigan is where I'm from, to do away with tipped minimum wage and guarantee guarantee that people who choose to go into the restaurant industry will be able to make career out of it, and those employers who want to make sure that their staff are taken care of don't have to play in an uneven playing field. I think food is underrated and undervalued, and our labor force is underappreciated and undervalued as well. And I think that if there's like a fair labor and wage legislature coming from the states, it would make our industry better.
Great. I have a question for both of you. Are you hopeful that the restaurant industry will emerge from this pandemic with a stronger focus on social justice? Can it be a catalyst to deal with some of the issues that you've been talking about here, like toxic restaurant culture, pay disparity between front and back of house, tipping, those kinds of things? Are you hopeful about that? And we'll start with Kevin.
Well, as the resident chef instructor who trains future chefs, I'm very hopeful that we can emerge in a better industry, and I think it definitely will start with, of course, having discussions like these, educating people on what the real issues are in the restaurant industry, and not just glaze over, the wage disparity, racism, the unfair treatment of women in the industry, the the lack of capital given to people of color, so on and so forth. But I do remain hopeful. I mean, I see here in Charleston that the restaurant industry is coming back, and restaurants are becoming full again. And I just hope that the leaders who have taken the charge to really address the social issues of the restaurant industry continue, and that it's not just lip service, and that we just keep pushing forward to to allow for our industry to basically repair, because we're still to continue.
I hate to cut this short. It's been a wonderful presentation, but I've come on to tell you we're wrapping up. But everyone, stay tuned, as our presenters will be back after some quick networking instructions to share their top takeaway in one sentence. But I want to tell everybody we're going to our networking break, which is sponsored by Kellogg's Away from Home. And in our sessions, we will be talking with Kevin Mitchell for a Meet the Author conversation, as well as Sophie Egan and Eve Turo-Paul. Or you can click on the networking tab on the left for a 4-minute one-on-one video chat. And today's topic is, what is your primary sustainability priority for 2021? Also in our Innovation Hub, please see culinary demos, insightful presentations, and plant-forward innovation inspiration from our generous sponsors. That networking break will be 20 minutes. And then from there, we're going back to main stage at 5 p.m. 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 Pacific, for our general session focused on strategies and innovation for rebuilding. So I am going to start with Jihei and ask you for your top takeaway in one sentence.
This is an opportunity. It's opportunity for positive change, and I really hope that we don't let that slide.
Okay, great. And Kevin?
I will piggyback a little bit on what Jihei said. This is definitely an opportunity, and it is our responsibility as leaders to continue to push forward and to push the envelope.
Okay, Max?
I think it's very exciting and inspiring to hear from people and get together with people who have, who have similar goals in terms of food and restaurants. And I hope that others listening continue to do that and get together with people who you share a vision with, and learn from each other, so that we can continue to make positive change in the industry.
Great. And Taylor, we'll wrap up with you.
Thanks, and thanks to all of our panelists. This was a great session. My takeaway is that sustainability is about more than just the environment. That's really important, but it involves social issues too, and we need to be thinking about that as we move forward.
Great. Well, thank you again all so much. This has been a very important and insightful presentation. I appreciate all of your time. And Kevin, I'll see you in sessions, and everyone enjoy that networking break. Okay. Thank you.